Megan and James were driving toward a secluded lakeside Airbnb for a much-needed weekend getaway. After years of chaotic relationships, Megan finally believed she could leave her past behind and enjoy a peaceful retreat with James. As they drove down the narrow, winding road lined with autumn leaves, a sense of tranquility washed over her. When they finally arrived at the cozy wooden cabin by the lake, the interior had an old but warm atmosphere. A large fireplace, antique furniture, and a rocking chair in the center of the room made the place feel like something out of a novel. There was a faint, musty smell lingering in the air, but James assured her it was normal for old wooden houses. As they unpacked their belongings, Megan noticed the steady tick-tock of the antique clock above the fireplace. At first, she found it soothing, but as she listened closer, she swore the rhythm of the ticking sounded eerily similar to someone breathing. Shaking off the thought, she tried to focus on enjoying the weekend with James. The next morning, Megan woke up early and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As she reached for the coffee beans, she suddenly froze. Sitting in the middle of the countertop was a small, old ring. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, turning it over in her palm. The inscription inside made her blood run cold. Megan and Alex. This was impossible. She had gotten rid of this ring years ago. How could it be here? She rushed to show James, but he simply shrugged. "It's probably just something left behind by the owner," he said. But Megan knew better. This wasn't just any ring. It belonged to Alex, her ex-boyfriend. He had been obsessive, controlling, and violent. It had taken everything in her to escape him and rebuild her life. Now, in this isolated house, his memory had surfaced in the most terrifying way. That evening, James lit the fireplace as the temperature dropped, and they shared a bottle of wine, trying to relax. But Megan couldn't shake the unease growing inside her. She considered texting the Airbnb host, but hesitated when James gently took her phone. "Don't let this ruin our trip," he said. As night fell, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaking of the house. Was the rocking chair moving? Just as she was finally drifting off, the bedroom door creaked open. A sliver of moonlight illuminated the slowly widening gap. James was still sound asleep, his soft snores filling the room. Megan sat up, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she pushed back the covers and stepped toward the door. Then her eyes landed on the mirror in the hallway. Written in smeared red letters was a message. "You haven't forgotten me, have you?" Her chest tightened as she heard it, a whisper chillingly close to her ear. "I never left you." Megan's entire body froze. That voice, it was Alex. She didn't dare turn around. Panic surging through her, she reached for James and shook him violently. "Wake up," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. He groggily opened his eyes and looked at her in confusion. Megan lifted a trembling hand and pointed to the mirror. When James turned on the light, the writing was gone. But Megan knew what she had seen. She knew it wasn't her imagination. Tears welled in her eyes as she grabbed James's arm. "We need to leave. Now," she whispered. At first, he resisted, thinking she was overreacting. But when he saw the terror in her face, he finally relented. Without packing their things, they rushed outside. As they climbed into the car, Megan thought she saw a shadow in the back seat. But the moment James hit the gas, it vanished. When they reached town, they called the police. Officers investigated the cabin but found nothing out of the ordinary. The Airbnb host insisted no previous guests had ever reported anything strange. Megan knew better. Alex had been there. Maybe not physically, but in some way he had never truly left. A week later, Megan tried to convince herself it had all been in her head, that it was just a bad memory resurfacing in the wrong place. But then, one morning, she found something in her mail, a photograph tucked between the envelopes. It was a picture of her and Alex, standing in front of the lake house. Scrawled in the corner were two chilling words: "See you soon." Ethan was determined to start a new chapter in his life. After his turbulent relationship with Laura, all he wanted was peace. Months of arguments, threats, and tears had finally led him to leave her. He had moved into a new apartment, focusing on his job. After everything he had been through, he was trying to rebuild himself. The first few weeks were promising. His apartment was small but modern and comfortable. For the first time in a long while, he truly felt at ease. Or so he thought. At first, everything seemed normal. He went to work in the mornings, returned home exhausted in the evenings, and often fell asleep in front of the TV. But after a while, he started noticing small, unsettling details. His keys weren't where he had left them, and his shirts looked as if someone else had folded them. At first, he blamed it on exhaustion, but the unease inside him kept growing. One night, as he entered his bedroom, he noticed a small heart symbol drawn in red lipstick on the corner of his mirror. His breath caught in his throat. With his heart pounding, he wiped the mirror clean. He tried to think rationally. Maybe the mark had been there from before he moved in. But the next day, it appeared again on the bathroom mirror. This time, there was a note beneath it. "Did you miss me?" That was the moment he knew. This was no coincidence. He couldn't sleep that night. He checked every door and window. Everything was locked. And yet, a gnawing feeling inside him told him he wasn't alone. Lying in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, he held his breath and listened to his surroundings. Just as he was drifting off, he heard a faint noise from the kitchen. A soft clinking sound. He jolted upright. His entire body turned cold. Gripping a heavy book, he slowly made his way toward the kitchen. The light was off, but the refrigerator door was slightly open. Inside, there was only a single piece of paper. His hands trembled as he picked it up and read, "You can't forget me, Ethan. I'm with you." His heart pounded violently. He stepped back slowly, and then, a rustling sound behind him. He spun around, his breath hitching in his throat. In the dim shadows, someone was watching him. Laura. She stood there with a twisted smile. But how? Hadn't he gotten rid of her months ago? Ethan's blood ran cold. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Laura took a step closer. In the faint light, her eyes looked dark and empty, like bottomless pits. "I never left you, Ethan," she whispered. Hearing that voice burned into his mind, sent his survival instincts into overdrive. Terrified, he bolted from the apartment, taking the stairs 3 at a time until he burst out onto the street. Gasping for breath, he called the police. But when they searched his apartment, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no traces of anyone else. It was as if Laura had never been there. But Ethan knew the truth. He was sure he had seen her that night. And every time he looked into a mirror, the shadow just behind his shoulder reminded him he was still being watched. Lena had finally put her life back together after a long and painful relationship. Moving to a new city was supposed to be her fresh start, a place where she could be free from the shadow of her past. Her breakup with Marcus had been anything but smooth. His possessive nature had turned aggressive, and she had spent the last few months of their relationship living in fear. That's why she had chosen to leave quietly, without a trace, severing all ties and hoping never to hear from him again. At first, her new life seemed peaceful. She found a small but cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, got a stable job, and started settling into a routine. The weight of Marcus's presence slowly lifted from her shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, she felt safe. But that feeling didn't last. A week after moving in, she found a small folded note slipped under her door. It was handwritten in neat, careful strokes. "You look beautiful." Lena frowned. She didn't recognize the handwriting, and at first she brushed it off as a mistake. Maybe a neighbor had meant to send it to someone else. But when she found another note the next morning, her stomach twisted. This one read, "Don't sleep with your window open at night." The words sent a chill down her spine. Was someone watching her? She tried to convince herself it was a prank or a coincidence, but deep down, an old, familiar fear began creeping back. Days passed and the notes kept coming. Each was more unsettling than the last. "I love your new haircut. You shouldn't walk home alone at night. I've missed you." She started locking her windows and double-checking the door before bed. Her paranoia grew with each passing day, her eyes scanning every shadow as she walked home. She told herself it wasn't Marcus. He didn't know where she was. He couldn't have known, right? Then, one night, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Her breath hitched as she read the words on the screen. "Open the door." Her hands shook so violently that she dropped the phone. It landed with a dull thud on the wooden floor. Her mind raced. Should she call the police? Run? Was someone outside? As she slowly approached the door, another note slid in from underneath. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling. This time the message was different. Just 2 words: behind you. Her entire body froze. The apartment lights flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she forced herself to stay still. The silence around her was deafening. And then, she felt it. The unmistakable presence of someone else in the room. Her instincts screamed at her to move, but terror pinned her to the spot. She wasn't alone. She forced herself to reach for her phone, her fingers scrambling across the floor in the darkness. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she tried to dial for help. But before she could, a cold breath ghosted against the back of her neck. She spun around, but there was nothing. Just empty space. The air was thick with something unseen, something watching. Sirens blared in the distance. She had managed to hit the emergency dial in her panic. When the police arrived, they found her curled up against the door, shaking, unable to explain what had happened. There were no signs of forced entry, no intruder, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was as if the entire thing had been a nightmare. But Lena knew what she had felt. She knew what she had seen. Before leaving, one of the officers bent down to pick up something just outside her door. Another note. He turned to her, his expression unreadable as he handed it over. In the dim hallway light, she read the words scrawled in ink. "I'm watching you." Lena packed her bags and left the city the next morning. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She deleted her social media, changed her phone number, and disappeared, desperate to escape whoever had found her. But no matter how far she ran, the notes followed. Each morning, in every new home, she would find a single slip of paper waiting in her mailbox. No return address, no sender. Just one simple message. "Did you miss me?